Hi, welcome back to the recap room. In today's video, we're going to be talking about a Norwegian disaster film titled The Quake. Be warned, this video contains some major spoilers. The movie begins with Christian being called in for an interview. A year has passed since a disastrous tsunami in Geiranger. Since Christian was able to foresee the disaster, he builds up a reputation for himself. In the talk show, he discusses how he managed to discover the oncoming disaster and what he was able to do to prevent mass casualties. The scene then changes to a few years later when Christian is now divorced. His daughter Julia is on a ferry, making her way to his house to spend a few days with him. She arrives at the bus stop and calls Christian, who comes to pick her up. Christian feels awkward around his daughter, as they no longer live together and are not as close as he would have liked. He takes her back to his house and gives her a room to settle into. As Julia enters the room, she notices that there are pictures of all the people who had lost their lives during the tsunami. When Julia asks Christian who these people are, he gives her an honest answer. Julia tells her father that he should not be blaming himself since he was able to save several lives, including hers and her mother's. Julia goes to sleep for the night, and a rattled Christian goes to his room to take his medication. Christian had become depressed and withdrawn after the disaster because he felt like he had not done enough to protect everyone, and the tsunami ended up leaving a lot of devastation in its wake. Due to this, he had become obsessed with looking for early signs of a natural disaster. This obsession caused him to become isolated. The next morning, Julia is excited to bond with Christian and makes breakfast for both of them before inviting her to join him. This overwhelms Christian as he wanted to focus on finding where the next disaster might hit. Julia being there makes him distracted, and he fears that if she stays with him, she will get hurt. So he tells her that he needs her to go so that he can focus on his work. He helps her board a ferry back to Oslo while promising to catch up with her at a later time. When Christian comes back home, he turns on the TV and sees a news anchor reporting that the Oslo tunnel had collapsed due to landsliding and had killed 2 people, including Christian's friend Konrad Lindblom, who was in the tunnel due to the research that he was conducting. Christian quickly checks his phone and finds that he had a few missed calls from Konrad. Christian realizes that Konrad might have been calling him because he had discovered something important that he wanted to share with him. He then grabs a parcel that he had received a few days earlier but had forgotten to check up on. He opens it to discover several files and papers tucked in and begins to read them. He finds that Konrad was also researching the possibility of another natural disaster hitting them. He has attached news clippings of a mega earthquake that hit the country in 1904. Konrad feared that another earthquake was going to devastate their country and had been recording and monitoring seismic activity. He had predicted that an earthquake was going to hit them soon, and the epicenter was going to be near the Oslo tunnel, and the magnitude could be around 7.9 on the Richter scale. Christian decides that he needs to look more into Konrad's research, and although he feels anxious, he leaves for Oslo. There, he meets up with Konrad's supervisor, Johannes Loberg. Christian presents him with Konrad's research. Johannes shows Christian their seismic activity monitoring system and tells him that they are continuously keeping an eye on the monitors, but the seismic activity that Konrad had seen and was fixated upon was due to a bombing in a nearby construction site. He assures Christian that they are not in danger and there are no risk of earthquakes for the time being. Christian leaves the building, not fully convinced by what Johannes had told him, and decides to go to Konrad's house. There, he introduces himself to Konrad's daughter, Merit. He tells her that he's looking into what her father was researching and was looking for his documents. She then guides him to her father's office, where Christian notices rock samples laid out on the floor that Konrad was researching. He then notices a map on the wall and realizes that the seismic activity that Johannes had downplayed was much larger in reality. He calls Johannes to inform him about his findings, but Johannes once again brushes his concerns off and tells him that he cannot take Konrad's research seriously when their monitoring system is indicating otherwise. Dejected, Christian goes to visit his family, where he comes across his son, Sondre, and his girlfriend. He then meets his wife, Idun, who welcomes him into their house and tells him that Julia has a ballet performance coming up in a few days and invites him to Oslo City's Opera House and tells him to attend it. The two sit down and catch up when suddenly there is a blackout. Idun gets up to check on the circuit breaker and Christian goes with her. They find that there is nothing wrong with the wiring, and just then, the light comes back on. The next day, Christian returns to Conrad's house to study his findings again. When Merritt shows up, he tells her that her father was right to be concerned and asks her to drive him to the tunnel so that he can take a closer look at the tunnel that he suspects will be the epicenter of the earthquake. At first, Merritt refuses to go there and tells him that the authorities have sealed off the area. Christian then finally manages to convince her, and the two drive to the tunnel. The opening of the tunnel had been blocked by barriers to keep people out. He gets out of the car and removes the barrier to go inside. He goes to the site of the accident and takes a look around. He then takes a sample of the rock from inside the tunnel and gets back into the car. Meanwhile, Julia prepares for her performance when Idun tells her that Christian will be coming as well to see her perform, and Julia excitedly walks away. A few hours pass by and Julia's performance is about to end when Idun walks out of the opera center and calls Christian, asking him where he is. She tells him that she had told Julia he was coming and she will be disappointed to see that he never came. Just then, the rock that Christian had taken from the site breaks in half. Christian takes this as a bad omen and tells Idun that he fears something bad is going to happen. Idun is about to reply when all of a sudden, the ground starts shaking and the opera center starts to collapse. Idun rushes back inside to search for Julia, who was still inside. She finds Julia hiding underneath a broken piano, grabs her, and runs outside. She assures Christian that the two of them have made it out alive. Christian then makes it to the opera center to find Johanna's team there, and once again, tries to convince him of the seriousness of the situation. Irritated, Johannes tells Christian that the opera center was built with cheap materials and that the structure of the whole block has caused the opera center to receive the worst of the impact. He then tells Christian that he needs to stop believing that just because he had experienced one disaster, it does not mean that disaster will follow him everywhere. Christian finally gives up and believes that Johannes might be right. However, when he gets back, he receives a video from Merritt, who had found it on Conrad's computer, that shows rats in a cage who are suddenly dying. This confirms Christian's fears that an earthquake is going to occur in Oslo City that day. He grabs Julia and Merritt and rushes out of their house. He calls Sondre and asks him to leave his class, but Sondre ignores his calls and messages. They reach a hotel where Idun works on the 47th floor a few minutes later. He leaves the building and triggers the fire alarm so that everyone can evacuate. Christian reaches Idun's floor, grabs her, and the two get on an elevator to leave the building. Just then, they notice Julia on the floor as she followed Christian inside the hotel. Suddenly, the ground starts shaking and the elevator gets stuck and the building starts collapsing. Christian and Idun become unconscious when their elevator plunges to a few floors below. Merritt, who had followed Julia into the hotel, noticed everything collapsing around them. She tries to protect Julia from the impact of the destruction, but the two of them get hit and fall unconscious. Meanwhile, Sondre escapes from his class as students get killed by getting crushed underneath the rubble. Soon, Christian regains consciousness and he climbs out of the elevator's emergency exit with Idun. He manages to pry the door open and goes up. When Idun is about to climb up, the elevator falls on top of her, immediately killing her. On the 42nd floor, Julia and Merritt try to help someone stuck under the rubble, but when their building starts to tilt, the waitress falls out of the window. Christian enters the 42nd floor and tries to help Merritt and Julia. However, his hand slips and Julia falls on a window pane that starts to crack under her weight. Christian manages to save her at the last moment, and the three of them then safely leave the building. At the end of the movie, Christian, Merritt, Julia and Sondre make their way back to Christian's house, leaving the destruction of Oslo City behind them. And that's it for the recap. Hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and be sure to ring the notification bell to stay updated on our uploads. Thank you for watching.